Welcome to part 2 of your Forerunners of Modern Art. We're going to start with the artists of Greece today. Now, Greek artists of the geometric and archaic periods created sculpture and paintings that were particularly abstract before their forays into intense naturalism and idealism or realism. As you see in these slides, a definite progression takes place from the image on the left to the image on the right in terms of moving toward realism. Now, most people think that abstraction is a 20th century concept, and it is not. In fact, I think the only thing modern about abstraction is that most people don't like it. The Greeks, rather than going from realism to abstraction, started with work that was very abstract in the geometric period that you see on the left. Then in the center, the archaic period sculpture, you can see there's still geometric elements. Look particularly at the torso of the figure. But by the time you get over to the Hellenistic period, as evidenced on the right here, you have tremendous realism, beautiful sculpture. You look at the drapery on this winged Victory, or Nike of Samothrace as she's called, and the artist has actually made marble look transparent. It's a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment. Now let's look at some modern equivalents in sculpture. The image on the left is by Rodin, one of the first sculptors that we'll study in this class. And the image on the right is by the Swiss artist Alberto Giacometti. Now, here we see, in the 20th century, artists moving away from realism and back to abstraction. The way I want you to think about realism to abstraction is that it's not a linear progression, rather it's a pendulum. The pendulum swings back and forth. Artists for a while work more abstractly, then they start working more representationally, and it just swings back and forth and back and forth, and it has done so for many, many years. This, you no doubt recognize as the Acropolis, the pinnacle of Greek architecture. The columns on this work of architecture are immediately recognizable, and they persist to this day in terms of their influence on modern architecture. In fact, there are 3 columns out in front of my house that got its start right back here with the Greeks. This is one of the most studied buildings in all of art history, and it's really an amazing building in that virtually nothing in it is perfectly straight. It just appears that way. The artists, the architects went to great pains to study the way we look at things and to make this building appear to be perfect when in fact it's not perfect at all. A more contemporary exploration of the use of columns is found in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. You know him as a president. How many of you knew of him as an architect? The Mannerists are a very strange bunch indeed. They immediately followed the high Renaissance masters. Those turtles, you know. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael. So for 3/4 of the 16th century, these artists were in vogue. Now, the Mannerists were so named from the Italian term maniera, meaning style or stylishness. What the Mannerists did, they looked to other artists for inspiration as opposed to looking to nature. Harsh colors, unbalanced compositions, and distorted forms ruled the day when the Mannerists were painting. On the left is Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck. You could also say Madonna with the really long baby. Here the Christ child appears to be a child that's going to grow up to be 7 feet tall. But the elongation of the figures and of the Madonna's neck lend a certain gracefulness to the painting. And that gracefulness is picked up on in the 20th century by the artist Modigliani. whose painting we see on the right. Art is not, I repeat, created in a vacuum. Artists are always referencing the past in their work. Here we have Rosso Fiorentino's Descent from the Cross on the left, and we're juxtaposing that with Salvador Dali's Crucifixion on the right. Now, Rosso's painting I often compare to that of a bad TV set. The color is out of whack, it's out of tune, Christ has turned green, and you have these intense contrasts of green and red and blue and orange throughout the painting. It's a very peculiar image. And that was no doubt an inspiration to the surrealists, artists like Salvador Dali. What's unusual about his crucifixion is that Christ does not touch the cross. In fact, he's not punctured or nailed on in any way. It's sort of a cleansing of the crucifixion, if you will. But both these artists looked for strange ways to express traditional concepts. Now, speaking of two strange paintings, here are certainly two of them. On the left is the Mannerist Bronzino, and this is his painting called Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time from 1545. On the right is a painting done about 400 years later by the Belgian artist René Magritte. Magritte was a surrealist, and you look at his painting and you think that's certainly strange, but you go back to the Bronzino and you're not quite sure what's going on there. Is it an orgy, or is that figure trying to tune in a radio station? Very bizarre works. Works that, if they weren't so strange, might seem to be highly erotic, but I don't think you get that vibe from them. Paolo Uccello, a name that's a great deal of fun to say. Try it yourself. Florentine painter, also associated with the early part of the Renaissance. He was fascinated with perspective. In fact, a famous quote of his is, "What a sweet mistress is perspective." And he apparently said that after he refused to follow his wife to bed. Now, he was a particular favorite of the Cubists, and we'll look at that in just a moment. Here is Uccello's Battle of San Romano on the top of the screen, and on the right is his perspective study of a chalice. The Battle of San Romano was painted in 1455, and the chalice somewhere around that same time period. That drawing, really a tremendous drawing. Looks like he was employing his X-ray vision. The interesting thing about Uccello's work, you look at all the figures in the foreground plane of the Battle of San Romano, and you see that the poor people, poor soldiers, are dying in perspective. Look at the way the lances on the ground sort of all converge back to a certain point in the middle of the canvas. So this fascination with space made him a favorite of the Cubists. And we see here a Cubist painting by Juan Gris. And look at the knife in the foreground. It's really the only immediately recognizable form in this painting. And it's much like the soldiers and the lances on the ground in the Uccello. So Juan Gris, a Spanish compatriot of Pablo Picasso and a peer of George Braque, the two major figures behind Cubism. Diego Velázquez was a great Spanish painter from the Baroque period. You could really argue that he's the Spanish Rembrandt. His teacher's advice was go to nature for everything, and I think that's still great advice today. He mastered realism, but with very loose brushstrokes. You look at it and you don't for a second forget that these are paintings as opposed to photographs. Now, he influenced Goya, who we've already seen, Manet, one of the Impressionists, Sargent, Whistler, and Francis Bacon with his work. And let's see how that connection works. On the left is Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, I believe. Looks like a man you wouldn't be terribly comfortable confessing your sins to. But on the right is Francis Bacon's copy of that same painting. the screaming Pope. Now Bacon strips away the flesh and reveals what is perhaps on the inside of the person. So more modern approaches to portraiture, but with a definite nod to the past. I don't know which you prefer. One thing I have to say about Bacon's work is that it's a little bit like a car wreck. Most people can't drive by it without stopping and staring and becoming engaged by it, and that's what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to engage the viewer. On the left is Velázquez's Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor. And this, at one point in recent history, was judged to be the most famous painting or the greatest painting of all time. And you see Velázquez's figure behind the canvas, looking into the mirror, painting the young princess with the Maids of Honor surrounding her. And on the right, you see a copy of this painting by Picasso. Picasso was fascinated with this painting and made many, many copies of it throughout his lifetime. Now, Titian is the last forerunner of modern art that we'll look at. Now, when you look at this painting, you might think, well, there's nothing terribly modern about it. It's just very realistic nude painting here. When you come to Manet, however, the original, if you will, impressionist, you'll see that he takes virtually the exact same composition and changes the feel of it dramatically. This model, as we see her, is somewhat coy. You're not quite sure what she's thinking. However, when we get to Manet's painting titled Olympia, I don't think there's much question about it. She is staring right out at us. It's very confrontational. It's a little different from Titian in that it's not glazed so many times and there aren't so many transparencies in the painting and it's not blended so well. It's just a very dramatic, abrupt presentation of the nude. So this concludes our look at Forerunners and how they match up with some of the modern artists that we'll study. And we'll now move into the modern era as you continue your slideshows.